I'm working on my laptop too, without
Yeah,
all the extra space, you know?
yeah, totally. Yeah.
All right.
All right, Emily, we're actually live. I hit the button, so
Okay.
I think we're live. Um, I'm with Emily Doogue. See, I always do this. It's
It's
Emily Doogue.
okay.
I always do it. Always. Emily, you've been hanging out around White Rock for the past couple of months, and I really appreciated getting to know you and all the great work you're doing. I first just want to check in and say, like, how are you? I know it's been kind of a wild couple weeks for you. Your part of your family wasn't even here, right?
That's right. Yeah, my family, my husband's from New Zealand, so we were trying to get them back. We'd had a long scheduled trip, and when they left 2 weeks ago, we thought, oh, we might have a little bit of complication getting back, but we didn't anticipate that flights would be closing for months on end.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so we made the decision to bring them back, and we got them back safely.
They're like
And
probably one of
now,
the last flights out.
yes, yeah, and there's no more commercial flights through Qantas through the end of May. So we just made it in under the wire. And now we're quarantining and tag teaming on childcare and work and just managing, just like everyone else
Yeah,
is.
like yeah. So
Yeah,
y'all are in a quarantine for 14 days, right? Is that how that's gonna
that's
work?
right. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. Emily, you work for Catholic Relief Services. Can you tell me what that's like and what y'all are doing and what your work looks like in that space?
Sure. So I work for Catholic Relief Services. We're present in 114 countries, and we're one of the major implementers for US government funding overseas. So taxpayer dollars mostly fund the work that we do. We're working with the local church wherever we are. We're invited by the local church, and we do programming in health, emergencies, agriculture, livelihoods, microfinance, gender-based violence, education, peace building, social cohesion. So anything that the church on the ground is working on, we are also working on, and they're dictating our priorities. So right now we are kind of pivoting all of our programming to anticipate what are the immediate effects of COVID-19 and also what are the knock-on effects. So both
Mm,
to mental health, social health, and physical health, economic health. So we're trying to anticipate what that looks like, where some of the studies I read this morning anticipate that there will be, even just looking at the epidemic in China before it became a pandemic, the supply chains will be very interrupted, and that alone will cause a 1 to 3% increase in poverty in Africa for poor people in Africa. So that's just one of the knock-on effects that we're trying to figure out how to
mitigate?
work around. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So when you say you work with the church on the ground, specifically the
Mhm.
Catholic Church,
Yes.
and so they help set direction and initiatives. I guess y'all run through their work as churches that are operating in parish settings, and predominantly, where is y'all's work or where is your focus right now?
Well, as a health team, a lot of our energy in the last 4 days, everything's changing so quickly that,
Yeah.
a lot of our energy over the last 4 days is looking at how do we reorient programs that serve children and adolescents living with HIV or who have
Mhm.
HIV positive parents. We're also looking at how do we do no harm through the other work that we're doing. So we do a lot of food distributions, and that usually
Mm,
congregates lots of people, and that's their source of food from the World Food Program or other places. We serve people that live in refugee camps that are quite concentrated. So how do we isolate in a refugee camp situation? Every morning we're getting different requests from our colleagues in the field to our headquarters team to say, what do we do about this? How do we do phone-based surveys to figure out what people need and want when we're so used to going door to door? So we're
mm.
just kind of putting out fires while at the same time trying to think 2 weeks down the line, 4 weeks down the line, how are we preparing for a very different operating environment?
Yeah, I can't even imagine what that looks like. Um, where most like we said this earlier before we went live, most of y'all's work, I would imagine, you can correct me, is predominantly in the southern hemisphere, correct? Like,
That's correct, yeah. And really the majority of our work is in sub-Saharan Africa
okay.
for the health
And you
space.
spent, yeah, for the health
Yeah.
space, and you spent time on the ground in East Africa, right?
Yeah, so I've got a 3-year-old, and when I was pregnant, we moved back to the States. But before that, I'd spent the last 10 years overseas with CRS. I was a technical advisor in East Africa, and I served 7 countries there, flying in and out to
Mm-hmm.
offer support. Before that, I met my husband in Sierra Leone. We lived there for 3 years. I was
Mm-hmm.
doing malaria, so a lot of our infectious disease work is very applicable in this setting.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, I was in Tanzania. And before that, I was with other organizations in Asia
Yeah.
for a couple of years.
Yeah. So you know the East Africa space pretty well, or sub-Saharan Africa.
Mm-hmm.
You said that this morning, as of this morning, how many cases were of COVID-19 were
Yeah,
reported in
so,
Africa?
right. We had, I'm just going to open it up here on my computer. The numbers are getting big and the numbers are changing very rapidly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So let's see. We had, sorry about that.
you're good.
The Afro Health Emergencies Bulletin, 1,200 confirmed cases and 26 deaths. We've got a real reporting problem. So we are advising teams in countries that have no reported cases to act as if they had confirmed cases. And we're advising teams in countries where there's at least one confirmed case to act like there's community spread. And we are advising teams that have community spread to anticipate very severe disruptions in the health system.
Mm. Yeah, I can't imagine. We already see, health issues and limited resources in a lot of these countries on the health front, and the fear is that the United States health system is gonna be overrun. I can't imagine what it's like to start coordinating health responses in countries that are already limited in their capacities. I mean, what does this look like? And in some ways, I imagine it's going to be really challenging. In other ways, a lot of these areas are used to creating makeshift camps and like finding creative ways to treat folks. So can you talk a little bit about what this looks like in Africa right now?
Yeah, a lot of professionals aren't quite sure what it's going to look like in Africa because we don't have a large enough data set about comorbidity when people have HIV and they have COVID-19. How will that affect HIV positive people? How will this affect people who are stunted or chronically malnourished, whose systems already have kind of a compromised immune system for just day-to-day life?
Right.
It's there are a lot of concerns as well about how do you work around cultural dynamics when you have people living in a compound with multiple households, multiple generations, and often multiple wives even in that same compound. So how do you then isolate? What does that look like? So across the board, a lot of questions. What does it look like if you ask people to not participate in worship, which is a huge part of everyone's lives? Is that advice that will get traction when there's a lot of faith healing and a lot of theology around God will protect you. This is the way that you weather this storm.
Yeah. Are there anything like Sierra Leone, for example, is there anything you think that they learned from the Ebola crisis that can help them be better prepared for a pandemic like this?
Right. So in Ebola, like in countries that have experienced Ebola, like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, they do have a lab infrastructure now and they have experienced what it looks like to have very severe hygiene protocols for anyone coming in and out of the clinic.
Right.
They understand the importance of personal protective equipment, even kind of to the extreme. And they also understand the importance of community. So the key point that's coming out of a lot of documents, articles that are coming out in the last couple of weeks is, how do we remember that without community involvement, a top-down approach to managing any health crisis is not going to be effective. And one of the things that I've loved hearing from the WHO right now is that our keys to solving this are science and solidarity. So how do you bring a sense of solidarity? How is that part of your message? How is that even the central point to your message? And the faith-based community has clearly a lot to offer in promoting that message.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting to see the church's role here in the United States. Let's say, what's the church's role in public health, and how does the church act as a conduit for good information? How does the church act as a conduit for community empowerment? Making sure that we're advocating for folks within the community, letting our elected officials know. Like, I think there's a lot of good interplay here. The church is prepared for maybe some of that work. What the church is probably not prepared for is to try to think about what not gathering in person looks like. I mean, most mainline denominations have been kind of flat-footed on the worship side of things, but we do have extensive networks and assets at our disposal. It's just a matter of, can the church find a way to engage and like unlock these channels to ensure that, science and solidarity. And that's particularly challenging not only in parts of East Africa, West Africa, really African church and Christianity. We really also have issues around theology here in the United States. There are examples of churches that are still meeting, right? And one here in Dallas kind of defied it all a couple of Sundays ago, very publicly, right? And so the church has a really important role here to play. Not to believe scientists is maybe absolutely critical, because if we really think that faith is somehow being tested in the midst of this, that's probably true, but we don't test our faith based off of whether or not we're going to show and congregate and gather outside of like the restrictions that counties and cities have put on churches. And I think it's an interesting space for the church to be in, and I'm curious about what your thoughts are on how we empower communities to have a voice, and how can the church help empower communities and neighbors to advocate for themselves and feel like they have some say in what's going on.
Right. I think immediately it's the idea that communities, everybody has a part to play, and you have a part to play not only for yourself, but for your entire community. So you're making decisions on behalf of your community, and not necessarily just the people that live in your family. And then in the immediate term, also finding ways to solicit feedback for decision makers. Does that happen through an open WhatsApp line in a community where people can just, almost like a Dropbox, but you don't have a space for a physical Dropbox anymore? So gauging what are people's anxieties? What's the information that people are getting? Is that information correct? If it's not correct, how do you make it correct? Where are the social tensions starting to brew before they bubble over? Finding ways to monitor that, even by looking at what people are sharing through other platforms, other social media platforms. Kind of like an early warning system. We have, when we're working in food security, we have a lot of early warning systems around where is rainfall low and where is production low, and that's going to lead to food insecurity. I think that there's some social early warning systems that we could put into place. Still working out exactly what that looks like. On the community side, we're also trying to do a lot to keep groups together. There's support groups for people living with HIV, people who are in savings groups, and the savings groups are allowing them to share funding and financial risk amongst each other. And people want to keep meeting in those groups. So how do we create continued operation, again, through like WhatsApp group, mobile money, all of these different technologies? And then once it does get safe for us to be in common spaces, talking through, how did this affect you? How is it affecting you? And then letting solutions come from that grassroots rather than, I mean, the trick in the development sector is also World Bank just announced $150 billion that they want to put into the response. US government, global health, equally, lots of money coming from the donors, and we work in a system where the money comes from the developed world, and the priorities often come from the developed world. So our response to programming that money has to be based on what we're hearing and what the communities are wanting to do.
Or saying they need, or want to, how they want to use those resources, which I can imagine is always a challenge because no one writes a check. Very rarely are checks cashed or written without strings attached to them or expectations on how that money's going to be used. And so in this like recovery effort that, you know, we'll see whenever that is, when we start gathering together, when economies start to, you know, turn back on, I can imagine it's going to be really challenging to both leverage the dollars on behalf of the community and make sure that they have access to saying what we want the money to go towards.
Yeah, it is a definite challenge.
What talk about like, how are y'all doing? And maybe this is something we can learn within our own community too, is how do y'all vet information? And more importantly, how do y'all kind of stop the spread of disinformation? Like, how are y'all active on the information front?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of really bad information out there, and there's also like way too much good information for us to even sift through. So one of the things that we've been doing as a health team is we've kind of divided it out amongst the advisors to say, okay, you check the WHO reports every day. You follow these 3 epidemiologists on Twitter, because Twitter is amazing right now. That's like super consolidated, very curated information feeds that you can construct for yourself or as an organization. And then every morning we're meeting together to say, here's the big things that have happened. Here's a couple key resources that get the stamp of approval for us to then share with over 100 different programs that have over $1 billion worth of programming out there. So we're trying to keep the information that we're referring to be something that's a small collection of manageable, actionable information that's based on science. And I've been really impressed with the church's resources. Actually, you guys have done a very good job of kind of keeping it manageable, keeping it actionable, and responding to a number of needs that people are feeling right now.
Yeah. I think the disinformation campaigns are the ones that are so challenging. You know, even on my own social media feed, I see people posting things and I'm like, I don't think that's true. And you know, there's no way to verifications, obviously a huge deal. Yeah, Twitter's a really great resource right now if we can handle it and it doesn't make us like super anxious, right? I mean, I think like learning how to like really get very specific with our Twitter feeds and who to follow and who not to follow, it would be helpful. In terms of, so y'all distribute information out around the, you know, COVID-19 virus to y'all's teams on the ground who are then distributing them into the community. How do y'all manage to ensure that message stays in front of folks? Like, what resources do y'all have to like keep the messaging you know, front and center?
It's a challenge. That's a real challenge, and it's something that they're We've got behavioral change experts in our organization. There's a whole science of behavioral economics and behavior change about how often do you push messages out? At what point do people just tune out? So we do try to have a scheduled frequency of information. And again, we try to work through communication strategies that utilize multiple channels, and then those channels reinforce the messages. So
Right.
if we've got something that's coming out as a blast out on a WhatsApp group or something like that, then you might be having individual calls and you want to hit those same like top 2-3 points maximum in your counseling calls because you can't do the actual counseling. So we try to look at different channels, minimal actionable information, again, 2-3 points, and making sure that we're not overloading people with the constant, oh, and we also just found out this, and we found out that. In terms of the misinformation, we're also trying to actively combat bad information that's out there. And I've appreciated that a lot of the scientists that I follow on Twitter are doing the same. So for example, today you might see media that says that the virus can live for 17 days.
I saw that headline this morning.
Yeah, that's not correct. So the viral RNA was found 17 days later. That does not mean that it's transmittable. I mean, right now we're still at the point where we're saying it's transmittable for 24 hours on cardboard surfaces and 2 to 3 days on plastics and metals. So when you read things like that, we're also just again saying, okay, to combat that misinformation, now our number one priority is to get this point out again about this is accurate, you know.
Yeah, that headline was actually on Drudge Report this morning. I check a variety of news sources. Not all of them are of my political persuasion, but it's amazing to me how sensational we can get with our media. Obviously, we know that, but in the time of crisis, the amount of opportunistic headlines and clickbaiting that's going on is just it's phenomenal. It's just remarkable, and the power that bad messaging has on communities, digital communities, right? And the kind of fear it can stoke. Or I just read a headline today that said, and this was NBC, so I trust the source. A couple in Arizona ingested a chemical that they had in their home to make sure their fish tanks were like clean, and it had the same active ingredients that some of the malaria medication that our president was tweeting out. So they ingested it, thinking they had COVID-19, weren't tested, and then they've actually one of the husband in that relationship died because they've been taking. And so like fear and bad information is a really dangerous cocktail, right? And I think this is part of the church's role, is to like both lower anxiety when we can, be real honest about it, but let's not like raise anxiety within communities, and then be a conduit for at least the best information the church has access to, right?
Right,
And
absolutely.
yeah, you said do no harm earlier. This is like part of what it means. John Wesley, the kind of founder of the Methodist movement, had 3 rules, and the first was do no harm, and then the second was do good, and then the third was essentially stay connected or in love with God. The do no harm piece, though, is critical in situations like this. And so making sure that we are practicing sheltering in place guidelines, physical distancing guidelines, I think is really a key for people of faith to then like be good ambassadors and really go out of their way to make sure that the community is healthy.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it is a challenge.
Yeah,
and I think like y'all are seeing it, obviously, especially as you work within communities where it's just now like, coming into the community.
right. Yep. It's the do no harm piece is critical, and we do a lot of harm, sometimes unintentionally. I think
Right.
we should also anticipate a conversation very soon about what's the greatest harm. There's a lot of talk right now about how do you do no economic harm here locally, and public health officials are very, very concerned that in 2 weeks from now, we might be making some dangerous choices that will do harm and result to a lot of deaths. Um, so yeah,
You know, viruses don't discriminate, but access to healthcare still is
mhm,
an unequal platform and or system,
yes,
and I can't imagine um, like poor folks who don't have access to healthcare being affected by disproportionately by decisions to kind of like jumpstart the economy again. Now, obviously, you balance that with, you know, wages and like how are folks going to feed themselves if they don't have money. It's just super complicated. I guess I want to end on
mhm,
this then. How, as someone who has a master's in public health, how do you balance that, or how just internally, as you think through this, how does one prioritize what is most important for communities in the midst of this?
yeah. Again, I think the nice thing about public health training and like many careers, you're taught to think about the most vulnerable. Right now, I've got friends that work with people experiencing homelessness. I've got friends that work
Mhm.
with PLHIV, sorry, people living with HIV. Um, you look at people with elderly caregivers, children with elderly caregivers. These are the populations that are going to be most affected. And I, I think about the decisions that we make as individuals and what the repercussions of those decisions are on those populations. And I think that as a culture, as a community, as a nation,
Mhm.
we also need to be doing the same.
Mm. Yeah, and that's a message that the church can really get behind, right? I mean,
Hmm.
especially here at White Rock, we're really serious about, you know, people on the margins and what the gospel calls us to do on behalf of those. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's fascinating. We think like today is particularly challenging. I haven't really enjoyed being in my home all day long with a 2 year old. It's been great. I love them, but you know, it's a lot. The challenge is to realize that today, as bad as it is for me, it's probably exponentially worse for folks who are living on the outside of privilege and
Hmm.
power, and it's bad today for them, and they're going to take the brunt of it in 6 months.
Yep.
So like really our decisions have to be, you know, as people of faith, I would argue our decisions have to be first concerned with those who are most vulnerable and most susceptible, not only to the virus's health effects today, but also the economic consequences in 6 months from now. So
Yep. I think also as this blows through, some of that social violence, structural violence is going to become so apparent. I worked in New Orleans post Katrina, and the sociology of Katrina, all of the social gunk rises to the surface and it just becomes so visible. So I think it's a chance for us to be inspired by um, just seeing so clearly what those inequalities are and taking that anger and sense of sadness and transforming it into action, and maybe
yeah.
maybe we all come out of this as very different people and very different communities. I hope. I really hope.
Yeah, let's hope and pray for that. Emily, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it. I would love, I mean, we're probably going to be sitting in our homes here for the next several weeks. So if anything breaks or develops on the CRS front, or anything that you think would be helpful, I'd love to sit down again and chat.
For sure. Thanks so much. And if people have questions about, is this good information? Is this bad information? Is there good
Cool.
information sources? Like, I'm around and really happy to participate in the conversation that the church is having.
Awesome, Emily. I really appreciate it. Blessings on you and your home as y'all quarantine for the next several days. I'm glad your family's all back, though.
Yeah.
I really am. All right.
Me too. Stay
I
well.
bet. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.